in the last 50 years, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Tesla. Total market capitalization, more than 18 trillion, larger than the entire stock markets of Japan, UK, and Canada combined. Year-to-date returns of more than 50% a year, and all expanding way beyond their original scope. And you can't just say, well, they were lucky they were in a good business, because if you look at each one, they've successfully expanded way beyond their original business concept. So Google, now Alphabet, it started off obviously as a search company, but now they've got driverless taxis in San Francisco and around the US with Waymo. They've got their Gemini artificial intelligence platform. They have Nest, sort of industrial automation and home automation. So what you see is, and of course YouTube, which has made them one of the biggest online advertising platforms. So, you know, big advancements. Amazon, the same sort of thing. I'll go through these fairly quickly. You know, you've got the cloud computing, the Amazon Entertainment with Prime Video, going far beyond being originally a bookseller. I have to admit that one of our partners in, I think, round about 1999, wrote a little newsletter saying how Amazon was vastly overvalued because they could never sell that many books. But yeah, that's a little story for us. Apple, I think I see, you know, dozens of those products right out in front of me, and of course they've gone beyond their original, which was, yeah, a computing platform, to be a communications company, to be an AI company, their whole app store infrastructure, and then their Apple TV entertainment platform. So again, expanding far beyond what they originally started in. Same with Meta, going far beyond the original Facebook concept, and Microsoft with LinkedIn, PowerPoints, the Microsoft Teams, OpenAI, and NVIDIA, we don't really know what they're going to do yet. They're still focused on the chips business. And then finally Tesla, some bumps in the road in 2025 for the car business, but still phenomenal success in SpaceX and Starlink, the greater Musk sort of organization. So, you know, we've seen tremendous success in these 7 companies. We've also seen quite a lot of success in the new business formation. So this looks at something around 1,600 so-called unicorns, which are newly founded businesses, not publicly listed, but with valuations more than $1 billion. About half of those based in the US, the rest in other parts of the world, particularly China and India. Interestingly, when you look at their focus, you see financial services and IT at the top of the list. Healthcare is all the way down in number 13, so we're not doing very well in terms of new business unicorns for among the healthcare industry. And in terms of returns, if you look at the S&P, you see from 2015 to 2024, 25% compound returns for the Magnificent Seven. For the slightly less magnificent 493, you see 8% returns. So it's really been just a few organizations that have just driven so much of the world's innovation and wealth creation over the last decade. More than half of all the growth in the United States coming from just those 7 companies. In Europe, it's actually even worse. So if you compare the S&P to the Euro stocks, a significant lag, and arguably all of that is driven because Europe doesn't have one of those Magnificent Seven. Yeah, so if you took out that, then you wouldn't see that effect. But huge difference. And within healthcare, we've actually seen somewhat slower growth and innovation in healthcare compared to the rest of the global economy. We have seen fantastic innovations in healthcare, but it's still actually less as a proportion and as a rate of growth than we've seen in the rest of the economy. And you actually look at the ratings for the global healthcare companies, they've actually come down versus the rest of the S&P.
I would just add that if you double-click in different healthcare sectors, you also see similar disproportionate value coming from a small number of companies. So I looked at one very recently on medtech, for example, just as it happens, and in the last decade, 60% of market cap growth in the entire industry globally came from 5 companies. And in the last 5 years, 80% of the growth came from those 5 companies. So it's been very concentrated value creation, if you will.
So why is that? I mean, you think about businesses in Europe, you think about healthcare. We've got plenty of smart people in healthcare and plenty of smart people in Europe. I'm sure there are fantastic people in this room. We've got access to technology to improve healthcare delivery. The same innovations around AI are available to everybody. And we've got underlying demand growth, of course, with the aging population. So we've got the demand drivers there. We've got the opportunities. Why can't we do better? And part of the answer is it's hard, as we'll see. It is hard, but our proposition for you is that with the right approach, it's actually possible to substantially increase the odds of successful innovation and get much better outcomes. Ilya, why don't you tell us a little bit about how to do that?
Why, thank you for asking, Stuart. Here, let me grab the clicker from you. Well, and that's where the real fun begins, right? Identifying a problem, consultants are very good at that, right? How do you solve that problem is the bigger question that most of us care about and where we really drive value. A little bit more on the problem, though, and taking this more specifically to healthcare. Now, what we'll note is these are some general themes. There are more specific nuances if you're in the world of provision of healthcare. If you're a provider, or if you're in healthcare IT and digital, or if you're in pharma or in medtech, diagnostics, there's unique nuances to every single subsegment within the healthcare market. That said, there are some common themes that we see across the board. One common pitfall that we see is the companies are frankly too inner-focused in terms of innovation. They think about it from a scientific or an operations lens. They don't think about the patient journey and actually solving unmet needs in that patient journey. It's too much of a focus on whatever it is that you're actually good at or you started with. And that's very different because notably, if you look at all the Magnificent Seven that we talked about, right? There's some interesting developments for some of them, but for most of them, they identified an opportunity, a need in the market that they expanded on and over the years, right? Second is about delighting stakeholders. I don't know how many in this room would say that customers are delighted, right? In healthcare, this is not that much of a concept. If we don't annoy our customers or make it too difficult to work with companies in healthcare, that's already typically an achievement, and you see that in all kinds of metrics of net performance scores and level of satisfaction in the healthcare industry. Typically, certainly not what you see in many B2C businesses or consumer businesses, right? But that mindset of can we truly delight the stakeholders that we serve is one that is frankly not very common in the world of healthcare. A third is around barriers to adoption. This is one of my favorite ones to talk about because even if you create the most amazing product that meets unmet needs and really does delight your customers, oftentimes we see companies miss when they actually bring the product to market. There's a lot around launch excellence that we'll talk about, but one of the biggest issues is that companies do not spend enough time and energy and resources on understanding the true barriers to adoption of whatever technology or whatever offering they are bringing to market before they're in the market. You end up having to figure it out as you bring it to market, and then you figure out, oh, well, there's this problem. Now we have to figure out how to actually drive adoption. As much of that as possible that's done beforehand is the goal, and that actually is a huge difference between the outcomes and success. And when we did this look-back study that Stuart alluded to of over 100 product launches in the last decade, leading to more than $20 billion in revenues. One of the most common issues that we saw was execution of the actual launch itself, which many people kind of think about as, oh yeah, well that's the simple stuff. It's not that simple actually. Yes, it's good execution, but it needs to be thoughtfully and strategically done. The fourth is competitive responses. This one is interesting because mostly what happens is people just underestimate their competitors. And this is the way I think about it, at least, but often companies are stuck with kind of playing chess with themselves, as I like to joke. You're overly optimistic around how your competitors will respond. And you don't actually think about it that, well, just like you, there's somebody in that seat who's trying to figure out how to make themselves extremely successful, build their career, and make you fail. So that's a really important one, and many companies underinvest in it. There are tools like wargaming that we'll talk about that are actually extremely helpful for setting proper expectations and then creating mitigation plans such that you can proactively overcome expected responses from your competitors. The last one, and I talked about this a little bit already around launch when we spoke about the barriers, but preparing for launch, there's actually a lot that you need to do in order to accomplish a good launch. There's a lot in terms of configuring the organization around having the right team in place, having the right incentives in place, having the right tactics and tools. I'll give you one specific example that I find kind of interesting that, for product companies, for example, you often end up seeing overinvestment in sales teams and underinvestment in sales enablement tools that can actually make every single rep that much more productive. And that'll be things like helping with targeting of physicians, for example, and providing tools for driving conversions. Think of it like there's all kinds of calculators and ROI tools and things like that that have become critical for success in a market where value is that much more important. These are a few of the common pitfalls that we see that the way we think about innovation in our book tries to address. And one last kind of issue, or kind of the problem, is what we call the doom loop. The challenges with innovation, they compound. In fact, you can end up in a vicious cycle where, because you haven't had meaningful success with innovation, it's very difficult to justify putting more money and investing more money into innovation. That's why a lot of companies who have historically not had very productive R&D don't put more money into R&D, and if you look at benchmark them in terms of R&D as a percent of sales, it's quite low and it persists at a low level for a long period of time. Well, how do you get out of that? Because you end up with poor outcomes from innovation that do not kind of drive further investment, but if you don't invest enough, you're going to have insufficient resources and end up with poor outcomes again. So you just keep basically doing the same thing. This doom loop is difficult to get out of.
Yeah, it has to start with better outcomes. If you can get better innovation outcomes, that will earn you the right for more investment. That will earn you the right for more resources, and then you can start to reverse that loop. But it's that innovation effectiveness and innovation outcomes. That's where it has to start.
That's right. To go from a doom loop to a zoom loop. And this is the way we're thinking about it and where kind of the new thinking is for the work that we've created in Predictable Winners. There's a lot of innovation literature. There are so many books if you go on Amazon or any bookseller on the topic of innovation. We read many of them. The problem we run into with most of the literature is that, one, much of it is impractical. How do you actually use it in real life? And 2, much of it is focused on, you got to get this one thing right, and then every problem is solved. And that's just not real. That's not reality. What we believe is that you actually have to get a lot of things right in order to be successful. So the approach that we've taken is thinking about the innovation journey as a journey. First and foremost, you need to configure your organization for success, and we'll share some thoughts on it, but some of this is around leadership mindset and the culture you create in the organization, but some of it is also around structures and incentives to support innovation and enable risk-taking, even if you're a larger organization, bringing some of the magic of the startup world into corporate settings without the kind of fluffiness that you usually end up having with kind of entrepreneurship programs. That's a starting point and a foundation, but these bottom 4 chevrons, every consultant loves their frameworks, right? This is actually a helpful way to think about the innovation journey. And the goal that we set is that you need to be thinking about the fact that you have many steps on this journey. At every step, there are ways for you to improve your odds of success, and you're in many ways retiring risk as you go. You want to kill concepts that will fail as early as possible and make sure that you're tilting investment towards the things that have better odds of success, because if you do that, you improve their odds of success even further. You're not wasting investment into things that will never end up getting anywhere, and you're losing on the opportunity cost of investing in something and making it much more successful. So, hence this green band at the bottom, but there's 4 kind of steps in the journey that we talk about. The first is around developing product concepts. This is about methods for identifying and kind of and finding the highest value, highest potential product and service concepts. How do you take early signals as input? And you see a lot of this in the digital world, lean startup kind of concepts around testing it, getting feedback from customers early. And we often think, well, that's not possible in healthcare. That's not true. There's actually many ways to get early signals and market feedback that you're on the right path. This is a meaningful unmet need, and or by the way, people are willing to pay for it. The second step is once you actually have the product concept kind of gleaned and really have significant conviction that this is the right concept to go after, you need to actually build the business case around it. We call it forecasting revenue here, because actually if you think about it, if you want to develop a robust revenue forecast of any product or service, it needs a lot of inputs. You need to understand the market potential. Who are your customers going to be? You need to understand the competitive set and what kind of share you can expect to get. You need to understand your pricing. There's a lot that needs to go into it and requires significant diligence. And frankly, going through the exercise of creating a business case that's quite rigorous will force an organization to ask the questions that are required to be successful down the road. And those who don't invest sufficiently at this stage, they end up discovering surprises down the road that are not particularly pleasant, that lead to the 70 to 90% failure rates. The third step is around launch. We already talked about this one. There's a lot that needs to be done when you actually prepare for launch, and launch can look very different, right? It can be, it can be like a proper launch, like in pharma or med tech that you see, but it can also be something that's a little bit softer in terms of like if you're a provider and offering a new service and you're trying to bring it into clinics, or if you're a digital platform and you're converting from one version of your product to another that offers a whole range of benefits or might be a different pricing model. There's a lot of things that you can kind of think about in the launch step. This is one that's very execution driven and where we see a lot of stumbles. The last step is it's not enough once you've brought it to market, and even if you're successful, what happens next is actually quite important. And a lot of the difference that you see between organizations that were just successful versus the Magnificent Seven is what happened later. Can you create an enduring franchise built around your innovation? And often this comes in different flavors. This comes from using M&A as a resource for building around it, because you're never going to be the only source of innovation. You need to find it wherever it is. It also is where you find where you find value from balancing breakthrough and incremental innovation. Many of the biggest innovations are breakthroughs. They're significant departures from what was happening in the past, but to get the full value from that, you need to innovate around it with incremental innovations, tweaks. I mean, how many iPhones have we had, and yet we keep getting the next one, right? Well, those are incremental innovations, but the first iPhone was a breakthrough innovation, right? 20 years ago now, almost. Anyway, so this is our predictable innovation framework that we talk about in the book, Predictable Winners. Great book, by the way. We can sign a few copies for you all if you'd like. It's particularly rare because you'll get both of us. We'll talk now about a few case examples. I'm going to hand it over to Stuart to share an example of a provider-pharma kind of collaboration led to a pretty remarkable outcome, and then I'll share a different example.
Yeah, we'll just talk about two examples. First one is a university. So I'd just been made chairman of L.E.K in 2012 and met with Ralph Muller, who was the new CEO of University of Pennsylvania healthcare system. And we were chatting, and he said, "We've got this thing. Some of our oncologists have developed this procedure, and we've given it to 3 patients, obviously all no-option patients, expected to expire in weeks. And of those 3 patients, 2 of them survived with this advanced lymphoma. 2 of them survived against all the odds, gone into complete remission. We think we might have something here." It was quite a complex process. It was not a normal drug that you just give somebody. It was this CAR T-cell therapy, which essentially involves extracting the patient's blood, treating it to essentially dial up the patient's white cells so that they can be reprogrammed to attack the cancer cells in their own body. So you have to withdraw the blood, process it, put it back into the patient, and then allow it to do its work. But and so a tremendous number of questions of how do you monetize this? How do you take this forward? This was a university; they didn't have that kind of experience, and so we helped them work through what was needed. It quickly became obvious that, well, is it a device? Is it a process? Is it a drug? The way it works in the US, if you want to get high reimbursement, it has to be a drug. So we needed to position it that way. We needed to find a way it needed to be a very high-priced drug because the cost of doing the processing was going to be tens of thousands of dollars per patient, just the cost, never mind what you need to actually pay back all the development and actually make a reasonable profit on the thing. So we helped them work through all of that. They ended up partnering with Novartis to bring the product to market. And maybe if you want to just click through some of the keys here, identifying the patients. They started with a very defined disease class, and the pricing sort of relevant for that. Engaging the delighting the stakeholders. Well, I think this was, the picture in the slide before was someone who. The young lady there was one of the first children to receive this treatment, and you saw her as a successful woman 15 years later. Addressing the barriers to adoption, very difficult to commercialize this product, which had very different. It's not like the normal pharmaceutical, which has 98% gross margins, and you make it for a few dollars per pill and then sell it for thousands. It was going to be a different proposition, but we worked through that, worked through getting a number of hospital centers on board as centers of excellence to develop the therapy, and obviously worked with Novartis, or Novartis took over leading the manufacturing and launch. There's actually a part 2 to the story because University of Pennsylvania, this was very successful for them. It generated tens of millions of dollars of royalties for the university. And interestingly enough, when they got another concept, they said, you know, we'd like to actually take it further and actually develop it ourselves. So what they did was, when they had, the next thing they had was a treatment for pediatric blindness. So a very niche disease affecting young babies where they were eventually going to lose their sight in the next few years. They used some of the, if you like, the winnings from Chimera and helped to fund a new commercial entity, Spark Therapeutics, which then was the organization that developed this second drug, which was called Luxturna. So I think it's just an interesting example of that, what Ilya called the Zoom loop of successful innovation spawning more successful innovation outcomes. So again, yeah, so the first one they made tens of millions, and the second one they made hundreds of millions.
Yeah, well, I think that they spun that out. It's a multi-billion dollar.
Yeah, Spark Therapeutics was the name of the company.
But I do think that, Stuart, to your points, it was interesting because in this case, you know, this is a provider organization that knew they had something interesting, but they knew they didn't have all the answers, and they needed to find partners to work with, which is sometimes the right answer too. Because sometimes the problem is that we try to own everything, and by hanging on too long or not bringing in partners that could be substantially valuable in unlocking the full potential, we end up missing out on what it could have been. And that's actually, I know at some point we share a statistic in the book around kind of one of the main differences between successful serial entrepreneurs and first-time entrepreneurs. Serial entrepreneurs tend to be more willing to dilute earlier because they want to get sufficient investment to de-risk it, and then they kind of think about it as a smaller piece of a bigger pie is a better outcome than no pie or a small pie, but big piece of it. So we'll go on to the second example I'll share here is Intuitive Surgical. I'm sure many of you have heard of Intuitive. They're for me, kind of a fun one because I've seen them develop over the last 2 decades in it's quite the journey. I mean, their valuation is astounding. But they've also created a market where nobody has been able to enter despite enormous efforts in the last 15 years. I mean, the Herculean efforts, you've got companies like J&J and Medtronic pouring billions to try to get in, and they have not been able to do it successfully yet. The company, just for maybe a little bit of context for those that are less familiar, in the late 90s, this actually was it started with there was a Stanford program with the Department of Defense. They were trying to figure out how can you do surgery on soldiers in, field hospitals or basically, as close as possible to a battle zone. And, can you do remote surgery? Well, that didn't quite work out as planned, but they basically created a technology that was basically a robot that assists with surgery. I think I probably don't need to explain to the group exactly how it works, but suffice it to say that by the early 2000s, they had created a commercial product where a surgeon was able to use a robotic tool to help them with laparoscopic surgery. And in the beginning, it was interesting because they just they thought they would be used for cardiothoracic surgery, and that was where they had started with some of their KOLs and some of the development. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but there was a different surgeon type that was like, oh, this could work quite well for this particular application, and that took off. But if we look back today, you have an organization that has dramatically kind of altered the standard of care for certain procedures. They're continuing to do that in many other procedures. There's clinical value from it, especially when you're moving from open to minimally invasive surgery where it's really not an option. But if you actually talk to their management team, the real kind of value in many cases is it's about reducing variation. If you think about the normal distribution of outcomes, it's cutting the tails off. Because in many instances, you see pretty dramatic differences in what the capabilities of clinicians are. And this isn't exactly democratizing, if you will, which is an overused term for the concept, but it is about reducing that variability and creating more consistent outcomes and more consistently good outcomes. The success of the company is quite impressive. They have a $150 billion plus valuation. They've been growing at double digits, 20% plus CAGR for more than a decade. Doesn't seem to be slowing. They've got almost 10,000 surgical robots placed globally at this point, and that is growing substantially, and there's still a long runway and a lot of white space in terms of the number of procedures that can be addressed successfully with surgical robotics. It's also spawning just a broader surgical robotics field. You see that now in hard tissue, in orthopedics. You've got robots being used. You've got a whole bunch of different robotics being developed for biopsies and for all kinds of procedures now, as well as flexible robotics. But a few lessons and kind of interesting points for this one. You know, one of the things that's a real struggle is creating, especially when you're trying to provide something new to healthcare providers, is creating compelling evidence, compelling claims. Everybody wants clinical trials that will be useful. Not as many organizations actually spend time up front figuring out what will actually be considered compelling by their customer. This is going back to customer centricity, right? Well, if I'm going to go try to sell to Dr. Smith, what will Dr. Smith need to see from clinical evidence to actually say, yeah, I want this product, or I want to use this in my practice? And that's actually a best practice you saw in Intuitive's developed very strategically in every single specialty, an enormous base of data. And it's not just kind of initial kind of FDA and CE mark claims, but also all the real world evidence generation, post-market data afterwards, an incredible amount of publications that they've supported with their KOLs. A second one is that I find really interesting is around the customer runway. And customer runway is, think of it as who are the customer groups, the customer segments, and in what order of priority. It's interesting. One thing that a lot of organizations struggle with is this concept of early adopters. The way I like to joke about it is like anybody can sell stuff to their friends and family, but eventually you run out of friends and family to sell it to. And if you haven't chosen your early adopters wisely, those early adopters will not be champions, will not be advocates who go say, you have to use this. This is unbelievable. So whether you're selling a digital health platform, or offering or something very different, figuring out who those early adopters are is really quite critical. But then you also need to have a plan for who next. And typically that is a function of two things. One, strength of the value prop. For whom is it valuable, truly valuable? And second, access. That one is less thought about. It's like, yes, okay, who else would love this? Who can I reach successfully? Because sometimes that's actually quite challenging, depending on what market you are. If you're trying to sell to GPs, for example, there's an awful lot of them, right? But in some cases, it's not that hard. Regardless, in the Intuitive case, the story goes on from these early cardiothoracic surgeons to urologists. Many of you probably kind of know this story, but urologists figure out that, you know, there's a procedure, radical prostatectomy, so removal of the prostate, typically with prostate cancer, that you could not do in a minimally invasive way. It's just the anatomy was too complicated. Very few people in the world were able to do it laparoscopically. Lo and behold, if you actually have a surgical robot, you can do it. So the clinical value proposition was enormous because, you know, for obvious reasons, moving from an open to a minimally invasive procedure has enormous benefits both clinically and economically. So this became the killer app, but they didn't stop there. What's been really interesting is their approach for driving adoption by specialty as an S-curve. So they understood that you need to create the right dynamics where for a surgeon you provide the right set of tools, the right set of data, and they'll start using it for a broader set of their procedures. So your urologist will start with prostatectomies, but then they move on to nephrectomies. They move on to other types of procedures that they would not have even thought of doing originally with the robot because they already have it. They get used to the tool, and they end up loving the experience of being able to control the surgical theater in a different way. You see the same thing kind of happening now. They've moved from urology to gynecology to general surgery, colorectal surgery, And there's an S-curve of adoption that they have pursued in a very interesting way that comes to the barriers to adoption, because they took pains to really understand their customers. And this is important because think about, like, surgical robotics it's a pretty hard sell. 20 years ago, when people were looking at this market, they're like, no way. No way. I mean, think of it. You're going to spend $1.5 million on a piece of capital, and then more than $1,000 per case in many cases for a procedure. Like, would you ever use it for a cholecystectomy? You could do it in 45 minutes or less with a good lap surgeon, and it's not going to cost very much. Today, it's being adopted for choles quite extensively, but it took a while to get there. But they were able to figure out in a multi-pronged approach that there's actually that you can kind of overcome a lot of these adoption barriers. And I mean, there was in the U.S. there was a whole marketing thing, right? It was like, well, that health system put up a billboard to say we have a surgical robotics program. Don't you want one? How are you going to get patients to be interested in going to your center? Or are you really the place, the academic center that's training the best surgeons in the world if you don't have a robotics program? Every academic medical center in the U.S. and most in Europe as well have robotics programs because of this. It's expected in certain specialties at minimum if you want to be a player. But this took a lot of time and effort for them to figure out, kind of step by step for each specialty. And there's some of it's technical things, like a product development roadmap. Well, you need a different set of instruments for a different procedure. So you had to figure out kind of how to overcome that for every single procedure for every specialty. The last thing I'll talk about is competitor moves. This one's interesting. And, this is a market where you have a 95% plus share of one player, right? Depending on how you define it, of course. So let's be careful about how we talk about competition or lack thereof. But they've been very, very thoughtful about how to create moats where it's really challenging to compete with them. Because first they created a truly an experience in surgery that delights customers. Like, if you talk to surgeons who use Intuitive's products significantly, they love it. It's not just this is a nice tool. They love it. And they advocate for it. But they've also invested in a whole host of things. And right now, the frontier is around digital, which is very relevant for many of the organizations here, because it's all, of course, it's diffusing everywhere. But if you think about it, where they're going is kind of like where Tesla went, right? Like, you had 20 years ago cars that it would beep if there's someone in your blind spot kind of thing, or you have a camera that shows where you're reversing with little lines that show you where you can go, and et cetera. But you're moving towards self-driving capabilities in Tesla, right? That is where surgical robotics is going. And if you think about the application of AI to a massive body of data around surgical videos and what that can do in terms of automating certain tasks, reducing risks, flagging that there are structures that you need to make sure you don't hit when you're doing surgery that create adverse outcomes. This is a massive kind of departure, and it further changes the value proposition. So, a very interesting example, a pretty different one than the one Stuart shared, but I think there's common themes around being thoughtful about how you bring a new innovation into the world and kind of systematically think about that journey from when you have a concept all the way to when it's in market and beyond that as well. So those are the examples that we had. We did save a little bit of time for Q&A. We have about 15 minutes or so. And we do have a couple of books with us. So
we've got 4 books for which my assistant Jay Shree will hand out to the first 4 questions. So oh yeah, you've got a job to do. Yeah. So we'd love to hear from you. First of all, any reactions, any questions? Go ahead.
I think there might be a mic running around, but let's see if we can.
Or just maybe
let's see if we can hear you.
A loud voice.
Oh,
we
perfect.
can hear you. Yeah.
We can hear you.
Well, first of all, I have a very different. In our group, we own several Da Vinci machines. I have a very, very different view of the dynamics of how the success of this robot was got. There was a lot of indirect marketing with patients.
Yes.
robotomy. My experience is a very good surgeon will be very marginally more comfortable with a robot. An average surgeon will become better. If you're a patient and you're given a choice between robotic and not robotic, we'll say, well, if I have a chance to even by a fraction of percentage increase my outcome with preserving my erectile function, yes, I will pay the money. Own pocket, from my own pocket. We could discuss that on the side if you want. My question, sorry, is really, I'm surprised there's one point you don't mention at all in your explanations is we are not in a free market, we are not in a consumer market, and the payer is often the real issue with innovation. I think it could be, I would say there probably is a correlation between the fact that the healthcare market is not growing as fast as the rest of the market because there's only so much money you can spend on healthcare. And I think that's also a very strong barrier to success and innovation. Nowadays, probably it's different from one country to another. I'm French, so we're really impacted by that. But I think that's a very important consideration in this industry.
That's a great point.
I think that's it's a valid concern. I think the impact of payers can be a challenge, but in the right circumstances can be an opportunity. But for sure, the near-term wins will be if you can make. We're seeing a lot of the innovation in healthcare today, applications of AI, for example, in improving efficiency of care rather than more value added. That's some of the near-term wins. But obviously, if you actually are saving lives, then you can get the right reimbursement and the right value.
I would just add, I appreciate you bringing it up because I think, look, this is actually one of the challenges I would say in healthcare more broadly because it's not just a challenge with reimbursement. The constraints around both reimbursement and regulation create also a mindset of, this is actually where I think it affects us the most. It creates a mindset that says, well, we can't innovate faster, or we can't do that. There's too many I can'ts, right? Like this is where a lot of, you see astounding innovation in the consumer world, right? Because there aren't that many I can'ts. There's like, why can't I do that? Oh, that's a problem. I wish I could get my kid to soccer practice, football practice, without having to drive back and forth 10 times, right? Maybe I can, is there a kid version of Uber, right? That I mean, it's like, is there a problem to solve? Let me try to solve it, right? And I think there are real constraints in healthcare that prevent us from being able, and for good reasons too, from being able to take the same approach that consumer companies can. But I think we too often use it as an excuse for not innovating fast enough or focusing on solving real problems. Because both of the examples that we gave, like there wasn't a clear path to reimbursement initially. They had to create and forge a new path because they had created an innovation that they knew was valuable. And so I think if you can create real value, you can find ways around some of these constraints. But the bigger lesson is that we need to challenge the mindset that these are constraints we can't overcome. Because it's possible. We need to work within them. But it's a great question.
Great. Any other? Yeah.
Hi, I'm really keen to get one of your books.
All right.
I've got a two-pronged question. The first prong is really in reference to your earlier slides about getting into the market. You talked about a very well-established strategy. You've talked about getting your product right, your market preparedness right, your marketing material right, etc. I've been launching a number of businesses over the last few years, and actually we've been doing completely the opposite, which is just really going with an MVP, a minimally deployable product, muddling your way through the market, finding out what works, finding partnerships, getting payers on side who are willing to go the journey with you, and then finding a model that works and emerging from that cloud of fog with a product that actually has product market fit, and getting investment along the way to find your way to that clarity rather than having that clarity at the outset. So I'd be interested in your observation on the different methodology. And the second part to the question is about overreach. So very large multi-unicorn healthcare companies have failed very publicly. Obviously, Babylon overreached with trying to do total patient capitation. And more recently, 23andMe with trying to do drug development. They could have been great, but the Magnificent Seven have never ridden in healthcare because of these sort of quite public failures. So your observation on those 2 points?
Well, I think maybe I'll take this one and you can take the next one, Ilya. But I think first of all, on the concept of so-called fast fail as a way of developing concepts, we do talk about that in the book. I think that's an idea that was developed a lot in Silicon Valley when you were developing new software, new apps. Let's just put a minimal viable product out there, see if there's some take up, and then if there is, we can have a version 2, version 3, version 4. Makes sense. Doesn't make sense. If you want to develop a drug for cancer that increases 5-year survival rates from 50% to 80%, you can't just throw something out there. You've got to wait 5 years. You've got to do 1,000 patients. So you've got to adapt. So the way we think about applying that is we've kind of broadened fast failure to think about promoting experimentation, because we think there's always ways in any business to try to promote the idea of direct experimentation. Can you at least test part of the product? Can you at least get some signals? So promoting experimentation, we think, is a great thing. Fast failure directly may or may not be able to apply, but promoting experimentation always does. And then the second part of your question was
Overreach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, fundamentally, you've got to have the value proposition. And 23andMe didn't have the value proposition. Yeah, they had the hype, but not the value proposition. You've got to have the value proposition. And I think the counter would be someone like Tempus, who developed that essentially an integrated database around clinical trials and outcomes to help guide clinicians in oncology and related areas. They actually started with a more narrowly defined but clear benefit, and I think that's a lot of what you've got to look for, which was actually similar to yours, I think, in robotic surgery. It could easily have been one of those failures if you launched it as here's a platform, costs $1 million, who wants to buy it to get your surgery a little bit more efficient? Well, they did it right by starting with a very narrow, extremely strong value proposition, as was talked about in prostate cancer and ED. So I think that was what they did right there. But great questions. I'll let you take the next one, Ilya, if there is another question.
Hopefully it's not a hard one. I just wanted to say that on the fast fail, like the framework that we shared it's actually not incompatible with fast fail or like the lean startup approach. We've taken elements of that and tried to explain how it fits in, because to Stuart's point, we think it's actually really valuable and important to support direct experimentation and to get those market signals. But in many contexts, doing exactly kind of the lean startup type of approach doesn't actually work. So you have to adapt it to the specific context. But the principles are actually compatible with the approach that we've structured. We actually talk about it directly in the book because we knew that would be a question. So.
Good morning. My question is about AI usage. I've seen so many programs, but it's pretty much noise and not a case for using as a benchmark to really differentiate our service. So thinking about a hospital provider, you have any good examples on AI usage that we can benchmark?
So thank you for the question. I was kind of wondering when would we get a question on AI, right? Could we have a session without mentioning it, right? Since, in the last year and a half. And it's a great question. So I think there's multiple kind of facets to it. First of all, is there actual value from AI, right? There's a lot of hype. There's plenty of companies that have made up stuff where you're like, that's clearly a valuation bumper. That's it. There's nothing else. It's like, we've added this AI capability, and they just changed the way they talk about digital health to AI. And for discerning investors and discerning customers, it's like, yeah, that's not really there, right? And it does create that kind of fog, right, where it's very hard to actually figure out what's real, what's not real, and it creates troubles for a lot of us. If you're a healthcare provider and you have 50 companies coming to you that all say, oh, I've got this AI solution for you, it's very hard to tell which one's real and actually valuable and which ones are just fluff, smoke and mirrors, right? So I think that is a real challenge, but I would say that there are actual meaningful applications of AI that are emerging. The one that I think in healthcare is clearest at the moment is around clinical decision support. There's clear value in certain applications already that are available commercially where, you can, for example,
Radiology would be
exactly, like imaging is one of the earliest kind of spaces where we've seen real value because there's an ease to training around this, and you have in a lot of these in a lot of imaging modalities, you're looking for the anomalies, right? You're looking for the small percent of reads where you actually have something to look at. And by the way, if you're a radiologist, looking at 100 scans and you really need to be focusing on 2, it's really helpful if you have an AI tool that will help you say, yep, you can sign off on these 80 out of 100 because, I've checked it for you. Just take a quick glance. Does this work or not? There's the whole help clinicians work at the top of their license kind of concept, right? Which is very appealing for any health system where you're trying to deploy scarce resources and you're all trying to figure out how to get more with less, right? So I think those applications, they're going to stick. They're going to be meaningful. They're going to be part of care delivery for sure. The challenge right now is monetization for a lot of these AI companies. I mean, one, there's all the noise that causes doubt. And so you kind of worry about some of the startups and some of those that, are they going to survive even with a great product? But two, I have a client that developed a pretty cool tool like that helps triage patients that show up to the ER with chest pains. Well, their trouble is different because they figured out that 40% of the patients that get admitted shouldn't be. So what happens, right? Okay, you have that information, but then in the U.S. market, for a lot of healthcare providers, I mean, one, there's a liability concern. Is the clinician going to say, yeah, you're fine, go home, but then what happens if they're wrong? And the second piece is, well, utilization of the hospital goes down, right? Do they actually, if they're able to fill, as one healthcare provider I know in the U.S. says, beds with heads, if they're able to do it because there's a queue out the door, great. But if they're not, they're saying no to revenue. And obviously that is a perverse incentive that's not kind of the way it should work. But a lot of these AI tools are falling into a system where the monetization, the reimbursement, it's not structured to support it today. So there's complexity, but I think AI it's not going to go away. It's going to we're definitely going to see kind of a lot of the stuff that's smoke and mirrors fall out over time. Let's just hope that the good things really survive because they will change care delivery for all of us. I think some of it's overstated though, right? It's not the solution for everything, right? It's a tool like any other.
Maybe one more question, if there is. Yep.
It's a follow-up on the point that you mentioned regarding the over-legalistic environment that we may find in healthcare. What is its role in stifling innovation? I mean, it's not a mere footnote. You have to address a lot of elements there for you to actually be successful. The case in point is Google Health. has been struggling with just to provide the benefit that they were promising in using this accumulated information for actually facilitating decision making in medicine.
Yeah, it's a good point.
The answer is always around, the best answer is always around segmentation. Who are the clinicians, the patients, the customers, who are the few, never mind the millions that you can maybe help, who are the few that you can absolutely help and will have a clear value proposition from this innovation. So finding starting small, starting with a very targeted approach, as Da Vinci did with prostate cancer, but as UPenn did with advanced lymphoma, finding that target group of customers that you can really make a difference for. And I think that's what a lot of these. If you're not doing that, if you start too broad initially, then that makes it much more difficult.
And I would just add that for the kind of liability, the legal, these are real constraints for sure as well. That I think, look, we didn't come here to say, look, it's easy to innovate in healthcare. It is harder, but our point is to challenge and say it's not impossible. We can do better in innovating, and there are examples that have succeeded. There's a lot of these tech companies who've tried to come in and be quote unquote disruptors, and they have struggled because the approaches that have made them successful in the kind of markets that we talked about do not necessarily translate into our market. But that doesn't mean that you can't innovate and challenge the status quo, because I think reality is we have to change it. Like we given kind of the demands on our health systems and the level of unmet need, I mean, for the sake of all of us and for the sake of all of our families and we need to continue to innovate. So it's more about how do we, within the constraints that exist, how do we push the boundaries and not let them, prevent us from innovating.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.